Hello everyone, my name is Brendan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator, and welcome to Womp-rat Wednesday. On page turners, they were not my Star Wars podcast. Today we're going to continue cataloging the planets seen on screen in the Star Wars movies. Major planets, I should say. And today we're going to be dealing with our second major planet seen in Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. And that is the planet Eadu. Eadu is where it all began. Eadu is a planet full of very jagged cliffs, almost like very pointy rock formations, and it rains a lot. Now let's talk about the history of what happened on Eadu. And this, of course, will be mostly from the films because I have not read a lot of the supplemental material and I'm not familiar with it. And I prefer to keep the information that we discuss on this podcast directly from the films, unless otherwise indicated. So Eadu is where it all began because that is where Galen Erso was working on the Death Star with the scientists at the base on Eadu. Grand Moff Tarkin had sent them to work on the project along with director Orson Krennic, and Galen was there. Jyn Erso, as a child, had escaped and hid, and so she wasn't aware of what had actually happened to Galen. Jyn was picked up and raised by Saw Gerrera, the rebel who was later more or less excommunicated from the Rebel Alliance due to his extremism. Jyn believed that her father had died, but Galen was at work on the Death Star and was considered by the Rebel Alliance a known Imperial collaborator. However, at one point, Galen Erso sent the pilot, Bodhi Rook, to deliver information to Saw Gerrera. We don't, in the movies, really get a sense of why, but it would seem that Galen was able to convince Bodhi Rook to defect, or Bodhi made that decision himself and wanted to help Saw. Wanted to help Galen. Regardless of the situation, Galen Erso had designed a structural weakness in the Death Star that a pressurized explosion delivered to the reactor in just such a way would destroy the whole station. It was later up to the rebels to discover how they could deliver a pressurized explosion to the reactor, and they found it with the thermal exhaust port. But Galen had laid his trap within the reactor of the Death Star and sent Bodhi Rook with that information to contact Saw. This would seem to indicate that Galen still believed that Saw Gerrera was part of the Rebel Alliance, or at least that Saw somehow had the resources to destroy the station. But it would seem that Galen was not aware that Saw had left the Rebel Alliance to basically lead his own group. Regardless, Bodhi Rook came to Jeddah to find Saw Gerrera, but was captured by a very suspicious Saw, and then used that weird tentacle creature Morgullet to determine whether or not Bodhi was telling the truth. The rebels were aware that Bodhi Rook had defected. Well, because Cassian Andor had met with that one guy, Tivik, I can't remember the character's name, on the Ring of Kafrene. And that guy had revealed to Cassian that Bodhi defected and was captured by Saw. So the mission of the rebels was to get in contact with Saw Gerrera so that they could get this information from Bodhi. Unfortunately, because of Saw's suspicious nature and militancy, the Rebel Alliance needed a way to get their foot in the door. And that was Jyn. So, to make a long story short, they get to Jedha, they find Bodhi, the Death Star destroys Jedha City, the Holy City. The rebels escaped. Or rather, Jyn and Cassian and Bodhi and all those guys escaped. Saw, of course, sacrifices himself because he's tired of running. And then the rebel group proceeds to travel to Eadu to get Galen Erso, either to rescue him or corroborate his story. So they travel to Eadu. Unfortunately, Director Krennic shows up at the same time, having learned that Galen had betrayed the Empire. Unfortunately, our rebel heroes were unable to get to Galen before rebel starfighters attacked the base. In order, more or less, I think, to seal any breaches. I think the rebels' plan was to destroy the base on Eadu so that no information could get out. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work that way. Galen was killed in the crossfire, but the rebels escaped. If I may sidetrack for a moment, I don't think the trip to Eadu was really all that important to the movie, because, I think the only reason that they went to Eadu is Jyn was under the impression they were going to rescue her father, when in fact General Draven, who was one of the rebel leaders, had given Cassian an order to kill Galen, to prevent any information from getting out. Cassian almost did, but changed his mind. But unfortunately, the rebel attack ended up killing Galen anyway, which I believe was the whole reason that General Draven sent the starfighters to Eadu, was to basically finish Cassian's job for him. Because the ship that Cassian was and the others were on crashed in those crazy jagged rock canyons. And General Draven figured they were probably dead, so sent the starfighters to finish the job. So, I guess there's a reason behind that scene. I unfortunately never felt much emotion between Jyn and her dad in that scene, but maybe that's just me. But regardless, the message that Galen was able to send out is that the Death Star plans can be found on Scarif. And that, of course, is where the Rogue One has its climax. So Eadu is an interesting world because actually a lot of things happened that involve that planet. And the reason I say it's where it all began is because arguably, looking at the chronology, we would have not have had the events of the original Star Wars film had it not been for the events of Rogue One. The events of Rogue One were triggered by Galen sending Bodhi from Eadu to get the word out about the Death Stars, what's the right word? Basically sent out to expose the flaw in the Death Star. Now, arguably, it would have made more sense if Galen had built into the Death Star had built the Death Star will blow up the first time it fires its laser. But that may have been a little too obvious. But, then again, if that happened, you would have had no original trilogy. So a lot happened on Eadu. Would I want to live on Eadu? No. It rains too much. Kind of a dark planet, lots of dark clouds, and lots of jagged cliffs. Not my kind of place. Though I can understand why the Empire would set up an installation there. Because if nobody wants to hang out there, that's probably a good place to have one. And imagine living there was probably pretty miserable, and that's why Galen and the other scientists seem pretty beaten down. But thank goodness for Galen for coming up with that fault in the Death Star and basically leading, in a way, being the savior of the galaxy. So a lot happened as far as Eadu is involved. I like the look of it. It's certainly an interesting looking planet as far as with all the rain and rocks, but for sure I would never want to live there. So that's a bit of information on the planet Eadu. My name is Brendan Moore. Thank you so much for tuning in to Womp-rat Wednesday on Page Turners They Were Not My Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.